But we welcome you both, and we thank you both for the tremendous leadership that you both provided in the recently passed infrastructure bill. Senator Bennett from Colorado, recognized as a pragmatic and independent thinker. You know, it's pretty interesting. He was both an education leader in his home state, as well as someone who helped create the world's largest movie theater chain. So it's quite an impressive combination. He lives in Denver with his wife and 3 daughters, but been just a great leader for broadband, for technology, for his home state of Colorado. We're very proud to have on our board Dish and a number of fiber companies that reside and hail and headquarter in your home state. So Senator Bennett, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Senator King from the great state of Maine, with a long tradition of independent leaders from Edmund Muskie, George Mitchell, Olympia Snow. Senator King is a leader on the intelligence for cybersecurity, but he has been both a governor and now a U.S. Senator. So he really recognizes how federal policy and states should and could work together, especially as we have this moment of transformational, once in a lifetime, generational investment in critical infrastructure. And for our industry, the broadband industry, your leadership in the bipartisan legislation was critical. Earlier today, we had Senator Rob Portman, so the bipartisan team that introduced the Bridge Act, which became the framework for the infrastructure bill. So we're glad that we can discuss what your priorities are, your efforts in the infrastructure bill, and most importantly, the administration, the execution of the infrastructure bill. I do want to add, Senator King, in his spare time, likes to be with his family in their camper and likes a good spin on his Harley. So welcome. Let me ask Senator Bennett first, if you could give our audience, and you can't see, but the room is full of people representing all of the broadband and technology industry. It's the first in-person event of the year, and so we've had a great turnout, a great crowd, and you follow a whole long list of FCC and congressional policymakers today. So welcome, Senator Bennett, and if you would, tell us your priorities going forward for the rest of the year.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Let me say, first of all, what a pleasure it is to be here with Senator King, who never lets politics distract him and is always looking for an opportunity to get something done on behalf of the people of Maine and behalf of the people of the country. And I think that's the story of the Bridge Act and broadband in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But since you asked for other priorities for the year, I'll be very brief because I know we've got limited time. One is to extend the child tax credit. We extended that and expanded that as part of the American Rescue Plan. It's cutting childhood poverty in the country almost in half. It's cut hunger by a quarter in this country. And I think it's very important for us to extend that and ultimately make it permanent. I'm also fighting to ensure that we respond to the real issues that climate change has caused for Colorado and the West. In the reconciliation package, that has taken the form of a commitment to spend $27 billion on forest restoration, watershed protection, and also $27 billion on conservation. Those are two things that I think we've got to find a way to get done that are left undone, because my state, unfortunately, is becoming harder and harder and harder in some ways to recognize, because we've got a fire season that lasts all year, and the conditions are incredibly dangerous and incredibly dry. So those are some priorities that I have for the coming year.
Senator King.
Well, you said exactly the right thing at the end of your comments. You said, now we've got to talk about execution. One of my principles of leadership is that execution is as important as vision. That you can have a great bill, a great idea, a great concept, but if it's not executed well, then it's not going to work. And so I think the Bridge Act, and as was manifested in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, is a fabulous transformational vision. The question now is, how is it going to be implemented state by state, community by community, involving the Department of Commerce and TIA, as you know. So I'm going to be really paying a lot of attention to that. The fundamental decision that we had to make once we pushed our colleagues to make the commitment to broadband, and it wasn't a hard sell, by the way. Everybody recognizes how important it is. But the real question was, is it administered from the top down or from the bottom up? Is it going to come from the FCC and through a long, cumbersome grant-making process, or are we going to provide these funds directly to the states? And they'll be making the decisions based upon their own needs and circumstances. We decided on the latter. It was not easy. There was a lot of debate about that, but that was the concept of the Bridge Act, and we ultimately prevailed. So now the question is, I guess there are a couple of steps. One is we got to get good maps. I think you all know that the FCC maps have not been accurate or adequate. So we've got to improve maps. Second step is planning and getting some of these funds out to the states to develop their broadband plan to assess where the most imperative needs are. And then the third step is implementation, which involves affordability. And we can talk about that and how to actually implement some of these ideas on the ground. We have some pretty good models happening in Maine. So that's my concept of where we are. We're moving into the execution phase, and we've got to make good on the vision.
So if you don't mind, it's very rare these days in the last decade to have a major historic piece of legislation with a level of funding and the potential to really be a once in a lifetime commitment to do something for the country, not only in traditional infrastructure, but in broadband. Take us, if you could, a little bit into the rooms of where you were able to negotiate the broadband provisions. How did you hold it together? What was the secret of the relationships? Your staff was wonderful working with us and all of our member companies and those that are from Maine and from Colorado, but all across the country. Give, if you could, our audience a little bit of insight and how you did something that's been so hard to do for the last decade, and that is reach a grand compromise that was for the good of the country.
Well, I think you start with a broad consensus that an infrastructure bill was overdue. As you recall, during the prior administration, they kept talking about infrastructure, but could never quite get there. It certainly became a priority for President Biden. And, every senator in the end, represents their constituents. And if they have bridges that are in trouble and airports that aren't functional and millions of citizens without access to broadband, that was the recipe. The problem was clear. Now, the broadband piece, I think, came into sharp focus during the pandemic because it underlined the lack of broadband, particularly in rural areas, manifested itself in some very clear ways. Kids couldn't connect with their schools. Kids couldn't get their homework done. They couldn't get their assignments. They couldn't do research online. That was number one. Seniors couldn't connect for telehealth, which was a huge, important piece of the pandemic. And by the way, it's something we need to continue. We ought to get rid of all those pre-pandemic regulations about telehealth because it's hugely efficient and helpful, particularly to people who live in rural areas. And then finally, people working from home. I mean, most people on this call, they didn't have any trouble working from home. They went home and they have good broadband service and they could get online and go to work. But in rural areas and small towns and in people that can't afford it, it wasn't possible. And so there were thousands of people out of work, tens of thousands, who might have been able to work remotely if they'd had the connection. So the pandemic really put an exclamation point on the importance of broadband. And I think that was crucial in making this happen. And I don't know if I'm going to decline that right now. And so that was a very, very important part of this process. Believe it or not, I'm going to have to drop off because I've got to do a live television piece on Ukraine, and they're calling me, and they're going to wonder where the hell I am if I don't answer the call.
Yeah. But,
So I got to go.
Broadband, Ukraine.
That's
We
it.
thank you very, very much for your leadership and being a part of our policy summit. We ask your forbearance on the delay, but we're very grateful to you. So thank you for joining us today. Senator Bennett.
If I might, I would just underscore some of the things that Angus said. I mean, like everybody here, I've been hearing about broadband for many years. Before the pandemic, I was a school superintendent, and before I was in the Senate. So I saw issues there with access, but I've heard about urban areas and suburban areas and rural areas. Wherever I went in Colorado, people told me that broadband was either too slow or too expensive to be useful for their family farm and small business. They also would say, haven't you guys spent billions of dollars on broadband? And why is it we never seem to advance the cause? And then the pandemic hit, and everybody in this room has heard the stories of families struggling to go to work and school at the same time on a slow network, or small businesses that couldn't effectively transition to telework because the local broadband network couldn't support it, or kids tragically going to school in Walmart parking lots. That is a disgrace that in the wealthiest nation in history, in the nation that invented the internet, we've got kids going to Walmart parking lots to do their work. Today, asking a student to learn without access to the internet is no different than asking, accepting a world where one group of student has access to textbooks and another group doesn't. We've had moments in our country's history when we've accepted those kind of inequities, and those are among the worst moments of our history. So, I think we need to rise to that challenge, and all of this created a bipartisan consensus that we can't accept the status quo, and that we've got to finally close the digital divide as a nation. And that's why I initially introduced the Bridge Act in June 2020, just a few months into the pandemic. My goal was to write the most ambitious broadband policy we could achieve on a bipartisan basis and still address the fundamental issues that I had seen in Colorado. We wanted to construct a bill that would attract Republican support, not repel Republican support. And that's one reason why I emphasize the role of states and giving local governments a real seat at the table on the theory that they've got the best understanding of needs on the ground and the greatest incentive to spend the funding effectively. And after we introduced the bill, I went to Senator Portman, my friend from Ohio, and he made some suggestions we took seriously and incorporated wherever we could. And then we strengthened provisions to make sure they align with other broadband programs at USDA and the FCC, and created a limited exception to the minimum standard new networks had to meet in places where, buildings to 100 or over 100 megabits per second wasn't financially practical. So I think that the recognition was there. The legislators were actually in the business of wanting to legislate. And then we had the opportunity of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and those things together conspired to create a success. And I'd say, just by way of closing this comment, that Angus is completely right. We've seen terrible implementation of prior broadband efforts, as a result of where the responsibility was lodged. We've changed that in this bill, and we're going to have to make sure that we do a good job. I think we will.
Well, I want to thank you and commend you and Senator King and Senator Portman. You really had foresight, and it was not easy. You faced a lot of forces that did not want to do it out of the old way. They didn't want the new way. They didn't want new standards. They didn't want both unserved and underserved. They didn't want future proofing. And y'all stood your ground. But I think most importantly, you built the relationships and the trust on a bipartisan basis to hold your framework through the negotiations, or most in large part. So we're grateful that y'all took a new approach, because for too long we've subsidized the past and not the future.
Exactly.
And you've given a good standard and good priorities for what is called future proofing. Talk a little bit of what you mean by future proofing.
I mean, I think the important, well, I'll tell you what I don't mean by future proofing was what we were inheriting, which was a system that was building out infrastructure to especially the rural parts of the country that was obsolete the moment it was built. And it's, it's interesting the degree to which people on the ground think federal telecom policy is kind of a joke at home, because they never actually see stuff that they think they've been promised get delivered. And people, Colorado demonstrated for years that we can deploy funds more quickly and more effectively than DC. And people across the state told me, just get Washington out of the way and we can do it. And you trust Coloradans when they say that. And
you
I
almost sound like a Republican.
Well, I understand that, but that is one of the reasons why we were able to get this thing passed. And I think, I recognize it doesn't take being a Republican to recognize that we've paid incumbents billions of dollars in subsidies to build networks in rural America to the barest minimum standards. And then the networks are, as I said, are outdated as soon as they're complete. And then, by the way, the FCC incrementally raises the minimum standards. It gives the incumbents another round of subsidies to do it all over again. And that seemed to me to be madness. So one of the things, as you mentioned, that was critically important was significantly raising the standards for any new broadband project funded under the program. We could quadruple the minimum download speed from 25 megabits per second to 100. We also said that states have to prioritize networks that are even faster, like gigabit networks, and can meet our community's needs in the 21st century. This way, we won't have to go back and rebuild these networks in 5 years or 10 years. And that's what I meant by future proofing. And the people on the ground that are actually the ones that are going to deliver this service, understand very well what's adequate for folks that want to run a small business or have a 21st century education and what's not. And I think what we've been able to capture in this bill with your help is something that's going to stand the test of time.
Well, Senator Bennett, thank you. I'm very proud to have joined Mignon Clyburn to run the Broadband campaign in support of the Bridge Act. We were the first association to endorse the Bridge Act. And we're thankful that the right people were at the right place and did it the right way at the right moment. And so, again, we're very thankful to you. We want to continue working on the execution of the bill.
Great.
And working with you on critical issues like 5G that are important to your state and our national security and competitiveness. So thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward to working together.
Thanks for having me today. Thanks for this great legislative victory. We couldn't have done it without you. And let's get after the implementation. And in the meantime, I'm going to go to the floor and vote. So thank you for having me today. See you guys soon. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.